Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give it just about another minute. There are quite a few people still joining us. So hang in there. We're about to get started. Good morning and welcome to the 10th Annual Dallas Hunger Summit, titled Top 10 Hunger Solutions, a Holistic Approach. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to start a little bit slowly because there are some technical issues and folks are having a little bit of a hard time joining us, but I do want us to get started and stay on time and end on time. My name is Beth Dexter, and I'm a development officer for Parkland Health and Hospital Foundation. I'm also a member of the Dallas Coalition for Hunger Solutions for the leadership team. And a little bit about our coalition. In 2011, the Texas Hunger Initiative joined Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson and many public and private entities to organize our first Hunger Summit. The goal of that summit was to inform the public and also our concerned leaders about the problem of hunger and food insecurity, and also to invite everyone to be a part of solving hunger in our community. Since then, the Dallas Coalition for Hunger Solutions was established and has brought together over 250 organizations and individuals who work together to develop ideas and to implement strategies to reduce food insecurity. The Dallas Coalition for Hunger Solutions, chaired by Congresswoman Johnson and guided by our leadership team, continues to hold this Dallas Hunger Summit annually. We'd like to thank the members of the leadership team for helping organize this year's summit and for providing direction to the coalition. The mission of the coalition is to empower all Dallas County residents to gain equitable access to healthy food. The plan is to create and sustain action teams. The action teams focus on priority areas of child hunger, senior hunger, faith community hunger solutions, public policy and advocacy, and urban agriculture. Together, we work to reduce food insecurity through our collective impact. Access to healthy food is such an important issue for youth, families, and older adults too. We know that too many of our neighbors are struggling with having enough nutritious food to eat. We also know that having access and to a good, healthy, nutritious diet helps to keep us healthy, and that when we lack access, a poor diet can lead to disease as well as to many health disparities. Last week in our first session, we heard from speakers that represent many areas of our community who talked about how to solve hunger and how to impact community health in an all-inclusive way. We examined how to create a more food secure and just environment for everyone through the lens of our top 10 hunger solutions. Now, as with every problem, food security is complex, and it's not as simple as providing food. Rather, we need to collectively work on all of these approaches. Today, we'll consider the impact of public policies on food insecurity and poverty. Our speakers argue public policies create barriers that keep many of our neighbors trapped in circumstances of poverty when there are concrete steps that can be taken to end poverty for good. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, who is in her 15th term representing the 30th Congressional District of Texas. Congresswoman Johnson was instrumental in launching this coalition, and as our coalition chair, her support has made our coalition accomplishments possible. Congresswoman Johnson was with us last week to help us kick off our Ending Hunger series, and she will return next week to help us wrap it up. She sends her best wishes today for our event. Thank you, Congresswoman. It is encouraging to be with many organizations and community leaders joining us online today as we prepare to hear a robust conversation about ending poverty to increase food and financial security from two advocates on the front line. Several organizations have stepped up to provide financial backing that help make this event possible. Thank you to our 2021 sponsors, the National Council of Jewish Women of Greater Dallas and the Episcopal Diocese of Dallas, as well as North Texas Food Bank and United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. And these groups have been with us for a while and are active and important members of our coalition. So thank you very much. We appreciate your efforts. Now to the part of the agenda we've all been waiting for, Ending Poverty to End Hunger in America, a Roadmap. It is my pleasure to present and introduce Courtney Collins, who will introduce and interview this morning's speakers. Wonderful Courtney Collins is an award-winning journalist, senior editor with KERA News, and lead reporter for One Crisis Away, a KERA news project about Texans living on the financial edge. If you're not familiar with this series of remarkable reports, you can find them online, and I encourage you to do so. Courtney is a friend of the Dallas Coalition for Hunger Solutions, who is always willing to share her time and talents with us. Thank you, Courtney, for being here and for preparing us for today's conversation. We are recording today's presentation, and everyone will also receive that link to the recording in an email follow-up within the next few weeks. I invite our audience to write any questions that may come to your mind as you're listening to the presentation in our chat box. We will answer as many as we can. And so without further delay, I'm happy to turn the virtual floor over to Courtney Collins.
Thank you so much, Beth. I really appreciate it. What a nice introduction. And I am so excited to be here with all of you today. I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers today. We're going to have a really fun conversation style interview where I get to talk to both Joanne Samuel Goldblum and Colleen Shaddox about their book and about the work that they've done outside of the book on poverty and anti-poverty measures. We're going to ask that if you have any questions for our speakers, that you put them in the Q&A or the chat. I'm going to be keeping a good eye on that, and we will leave time at the end of the conversation to hear from you all. We really want this to be engaging and flow back and forth. So if you think of something, I will promise you that we'll make a little bit of time at the end of the conversation to hear from the audience. So take notes or pop questions in the chat as you go, whatever works best for you. But I'm really, really looking forward to parsing through some of those Q&As and getting to those at the end of the conversation. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Colleen Shaddox first. She's a print and radio journalist, an activist, and co-author of the book Broke in America, Seeing, Understanding, and Ending U.S. Poverty. Her publication credits as a journalist include the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and America. Also, Joanne Samuel Goldblum is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Diaper Bank Network, also co-author of Broke in America, Seeing, Understanding, and Ending U.S. Poverty. The National Diaper Bank Network leads a nationwide movement dedicated to helping individuals, children, and families access the basic necessities they require to thrive and reach their full potential. And of course, that includes clean, dry diapers. So thanks to both of you for being with us today. Before we kind of dive into the book conversation, I'd like each of you to take 4 or 5 minutes to talk a little bit about kind of what led you to writing this book, what from your pre-author lives kind of inspired you to tackle this topic. So Colleen, let's start with you. I know that you had a really interesting story as a journalist where your editor was like, just quit writing all these stories about poor people. Enough of that.
Yes, he was a very special man. My story starts even sooner than that, though. When I was very young, elementary school age, I'm not quite sure. Mom supported us waiting tables, which was really, really hard work. Every night she would come home and she would soak her feet in Epsom salts. And one night, calluses and blisters broke and the basin filled with blood. And I remember looking at that and thinking, people must not know. They must not know how hard her life is, or they would help. So when I grow up, I am going to write stories about people like Mom. And I did that, right? I became a newspaper reporter. I was very interested in social justice issues. And yes, one day my editor took me aside and said that I was not, he said, you write too many stories about people with AIDS. Nobody cares about poverty. That's killing us in the suburbs. So stop it. And I said, that's not Christian and I won't do it. And I quit and I went to work in a soup kitchen and was sort of juggling both between doing nonprofit work and also doing freelance work of the kind of journalism I wanted to do. And in this time, I met my friend Joanne, who had a really unique perspective on poverty that resonated very much with me. And eventually Joanne said, we should write a book about this. And that was a great idea. We got together and we wrote a proposal for essentially very much like the book that ended up on the shelves. But we would go from publisher to publisher and they would say, that's great. This is really great. But we don't want you to do it quite like this. We want you to live with one family for 3 months and write about them. And we were very, very convicted that we were going to show the breadth of poverty across the United States and show that it happens in all kinds of communities, urban, rural, suburban, that it happens to all kinds of families, that it happens to all kinds of people, that it's policy, not people, that's at fault. And it's just fascinating how hard that was to do. One person wanted us to go like live in a trailer park and wait tables for 3 months. It's like, I don't need to play make-believe. I caught the live action version of that. And finally we found a place that would really let us tell the truth about poverty. And I think it's really interesting that it was so hard to do that.
Joanne, let's go over to you now. Obviously, the National Diaper Big Network has allowed you to really see how something that we all think of as a basic, easy to meet need is not really reality for so many families. Tell me a little bit about what led you to this book.
Sure. So, when Colleen talks about the perspective that I have about ending poverty in the United States, a perspective that she and I share, it's really based on the idea that people are not the problem. Policies are the problem. In most rich countries, most wealthy countries, poverty is seen as a societal failure, not an individual failure. It is only in the United States that we create policy that is focused on fixing people instead of fixing the problem. So I'm a social worker, and I was, 20 years ago working at Yale Child Study Center doing community-based social work. And I saw over and over again this level of poverty in the United States that even as someone who thought that they understood what poverty looked like was so much more extreme. And that comes through for a lot of reasons, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, about the idea of welfare reform and how that really changed the sort of social safety net such as it is. But I was working with families, and there was one family in particular, a mom who was developmentally disabled and had 3 children, 3 little girls under 3. And they never had toilet paper in the house. And, I was at Yale. We were very clinically focused. We spent a lot of time thinking about, well, why would she choose not to use toilet paper? What is this about? And it wasn't about anything except that she couldn't afford the things that she needed to keep her children and herself clean, dry, and healthy. And that same woman I saw, empty solids out of diapers and put them back on. And what I found as I began to research it was that none of our elected or appointed officials in the state or federally were aware of this issue. Everybody thought there must be some subsidy that helps people. And there just wasn't. And, now, 20 years later of doing this work, lots of people say, oh, of course, WIC and food stamps can't be used for these things. But at that time, nobody knew it. And interestingly, a lot of our elected and appointed officials tried to tell me I was wrong. So I became, myopic, I would say, about it. And, I started the New Haven Diaper Bank, which is now the Diaper Bank of Connecticut, the way that most founders do, with my husband and my mother and a few close friends. And we just started giving diapers out. And so, over time that grew to be, the Diaper Bank of Connecticut. I worked for 7 years there as the volunteer executive director. And then I was lucky enough to found the National Diaper Bank Network to really bring this to a larger audience, and also to help people across the country to provide this very basic need to people. And if it's okay, Courtney, I'd love to read just a moment of our book, because it's sort of the thesis of what we are
Please.
talking about.
Absolutely.
Okay. A common saying, accepted as wisdom, available on posters and t-shirts meant to be inspirational, reveals a tragic misunderstanding about poverty and its causes. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Anti-poverty efforts should stop making assumptions about people's fishing abilities. Maybe the river is fished out. Maybe that man is too weak with hunger to pick up a pole. Maybe he is actually a she, and the anglers club that controls the river does not admit women. It is past time to stop judging and give that hungry person a fish. Historically, the United States has approached poverty as a lack of knowledge, or perhaps of character and ambition, when in fact it stems from a lack of resources. We hope you'll adopt that definition as you travel with us across the country, from a dying farm town where the tap water is so dirty it looks like chocolate milk, to Los Angeles' Skid Row, where a quarter of the residents report eating out of garbage cans just steps away from a new Whole Foods. Nearly all the research for this book was done before the pandemic. The stories you will read here are not the product of extraordinary times. Poverty is quite ordinary in the U.S. When you focus on basic needs, water, food, housing, energy, transportation, hygiene, and health, and learn about the significant barriers that many U.S. Americans face in obtaining them, you cannot help but realize that poverty is close to inevitable for low-wage workers and their children. Solutions fall short because they often try to fix people in poverty rather than eliminate poverty itself.
Well, I'll take it as a good sign that my first question was going to be about the teach a man to fish, give a man to fish analogy. So obviously great minds are already thinking alike here, but I really appreciate you reading that, because I did want to really set this conversation off with a little bit more questioning into why you think the instinct is to blame the individual. I hear it all the time. I've been a poverty reporter for years, and now I'm a senior editor, and I still oversee One Crisis Away. I hear well-meaning people who are philanthropic and who donate to charities constantly make the point that if people would only X, stop getting their nails done, save more, etc., that things would change. Where do you think that instinct comes from to blame the person instead of the system?
Colleen, you want me to go? Or?
Sure, I'll start and then you jump
Okay.
in. I think it's self-preservation. I think you don't want to think that it could happen to you. Like, this is not new. In the book of Job, all these horrible things happened to Job, this super nice guy, and people kept coming over to him and saying, Job, you've ticked off God. Repent, repent, repent. He didn't have anything to repent for, but they had to believe that ill fortune wasn't random. I've had cancer a couple of times, and every time I have it, people tell me how special I am. And they always say, oh, why does this only happen to tremendous loving people like you? Like, no, it doesn't. Horrible people get cancer too. People want to believe that there's not a randomness about life, that life isn't just determined by these random circumstances of birth and where you live and so forth.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that on top of that, it comes from the idea of American exceptionalism, though this is true, I think, across the board, that people want to find reasons for things. The American dream, the core of what so many of us think to be it is to be American, is that anyone can be president. Anyone can be a billionaire. And sure, it's true on one level. Really exceptional, remarkable, resilient people in all socioeconomic areas can exceed. But most of us are not that. Most of us are doing the best we can and trying to do, what will work for ourselves and our families. But we have this idea, the pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. That's American. That is a uniquely American view. With the work that I do, what surprises me, and I don't know why it still surprises me, but it does, is the vitriol that people particularly have towards poor women. Poor women are just the scapegoat for everything bad. We only blame women when it comes to being pregnant when you don't plan on it. There are all sorts of things that only women are sort of, and I think that, we know the largest portion of people in the United States who are poor are children. And, the largest group of adults taking care of them tend to be single women. And we just don't care enough, I think.
I wonder if, Colleen, you could comment on this. As Joanne mentioned, the work for this book was done pre-pandemic. This is not a response to what happened in the spring. Is it a bit harrowing for you all to think about how the realities that you have chronicled in this book have intensified since the spring of 2020?
It is. And I mean, certainly Jo can talk about that in her own work. Diaper banks are seeing like 600% increase in demand for people who need help. We know that millions of women in particular have left the workforce because the lack of a child care infrastructure in this country just really came home to roost when you had to work from home, which is something only generally white collar workers can do, when you had to be overseeing your schools, your kids' schooling. But I will say one hopeful thing, the last census figures that came out, we've actually reduced poverty in this country. And that's because when the government was confronted with this economic crisis, it started giving people money, which is a strategy that we have traditionally resisted.
On that same note, I'm really interested to hear y'all's take on this. Something, again, as a journalist, we pay close attention to how much of poverty is political, and also how much of it is kind of responsive to current events. I want to get your take on the whole narrative that's circulating now, which is no one wants to work anymore. Since we started giving them money during the pandemic, we can't get any workers in. I want to see what you think about that. There's a lot of different takes on it, but I'm interested, Joanne, if you'll comment on how you see that being framed and what you think the reality is.
I think the reality is that we don't pay people a living wage, and that if an extra few $100s a month gives you more money than you would make working, of course you're not going to work. We have this idea, and it's, I think, really, really fascinating. For people of privilege, people of means, working is considered a vocation. We do it because we love it. We're called to something. When your work is for a paycheck, right? You're doing it to feed yourself and your family and to give yourself a better life. To say that work is the be all and end all without having payment for that work, without without being able to live a decent life, it's really, we've set up this false dichotomy. The issue is that people are not being paid enough for their work. Now, are there some people, are there, groups of, I've certainly heard that there are some younger people who sort of have taken this as an opportunity to almost take a gap year or something. Sure, there are going to be people who do that. Any system that exists, there are people who take advantage of it. And that is true for high-income people, middle-income people, and low-income people. But we're only really bent out of shape about it when it's low-income people who take advantage of things. And I think that that's really a mistake. I also think that by and large, people want to work. They want decent wages. They want schedules that they can plan on. They want paid time off. They want things that allow them to live a decent life. And low-wage work in the United States doesn't provide that. We're, I think, the only industrialized country that doesn't have guaranteed paid time off for everyone. And with the pandemic, I think one thing that has become abundantly clear is you can't work if you don't have adequate childcare. And, so my organization, the National Diaper Bank Network, we're still working remotely. And we made that decision because half of our staff has school-age kids, who some can't be vaccinated. But more than that, we have to recognize that all of them are going to have 10 days, 2 weeks, where they're going to have to quarantine their children. That is the reality of living in a pandemic in the United States. But we don't account for it. If you're working retail and your child needs to quarantine for 2 weeks, what do you do?
There's this interesting analogy you guys set up in the book. Colleen, maybe you can explain this, but it says basically when basic needs are not met, poverty becomes quicksand. What does that mean?
It is, you can't get out of it because all the things you need to get out of it require resources. Think about going to a job interview. What does that take? It took a cell phone to arrange the job interview. You need to shower and put on decent clothes before you go. You need transportation to get there. And when you take away any one of these essentials, people really, really get knocked over. Another analogy I could use is whack-a-mole. You solve one problem and then another one pops up. One of the main things we found when we've done outcome studies with people who get diapers from diaper banks is they use the money they save on diapers to buy more food. That's the most common thing to do. So, this week I'll buy diapers, this week I'll buy food, this week I'll pay my electric bill. You can't keep up with everything, and any one thing is enough to pull you down.
Let's spend a little time talking about water and food access, because I think those are two basic needs that are going to really resonate with this audience, and also that any human being can't really imagine going through their days, weeks, and months without easy access to water and food. But first off, and either one of you can chime in on this, but I did not realize there is no national program that exists to help people pay their water bill or get water.
Yeah, so water was, and Colleen and I say this in every interview, the most surprising chapter to us. We went into this, knowing that we'd learned things, but thinking that we had a pretty good handle. As we were writing the water chapter, Colleen and I would constantly be on the phone going, I learned this thing, it can't be right. This is, can you recheck this? Because I can't believe that this is true. And it was. And the fact that there is no, we have LIHEAP, which is the lighting, heating, and electric support, which is not adequate and doesn't pay for everything that everybody needs, but water is not included in that. And as Colleen always says, the UN would say, my friend.
Yeah, UN says that water is a human right. UN came and visited us in Los Angeles, walked around Skid Row and said, what are you people doing? We are in many ways not a first world country. In fact, the woman we talked to in Alaska, who lives in a village that has never had running water, she made that direct observation. She said, I'm living in the United States. How can this be?
There's a community in North Texas called Sand Branch. I don't know if you all are familiar with Sand Branch. It's small at this point. There are not many families who live there. In the 1960s and 70s, their once potable well water was contaminated by development, and Sand Branch does not have water and never has had running water, and no longer has potable well water access. This is a community, it's about an 18 to 20 minute drive to downtown Dallas. Does it surprise you to hear that you can nearly see the skyline of a major US metropolitan area, and the folks who can see it can't turn on a faucet or a tap?
No, not at all. I mean,
And
we talked to people in Detroit and Baltimore who didn't have water, not because of contamination, but because of shutoffs, which are really common. And yeah, I mean, I spent time in a town in Louisiana that is essentially dying because what comes out of the tap looks like chocolate milk.
And I would venture to guess, and I'll be embarrassed if I'm wrong, that this town that you're talking about is primarily, if not 100%, people of color.
Yes, it's predominantly, it's Black families that have owned their homes outright for generations and really don't have many options to move out because of the property value and because of the fact that they own free and clear, and most are on a fixed income.
So one of the things we found is that there are problems with water all across the United States, but almost exclusively in poor communities that are primarily people of color.
And people not having plumbing is not as uncommon as you may think. According to y'all's research, we're talking several 100,000 people, at least partially not plumbed in the country that we live in today.
Yeah, that's right. It's really common in Navajo reservations. Like a third of the homes don't have plumbing, never have.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, it's sort of like water. The numbers, I think part of the reason that people don't sort of know about this is because the percentages are very low. So it's like 0.5% of US Americans are unplumbed. So from a statistical standpoint, that's very small. But when you look at the number of people, and I think that that's sometimes where we, as a country, sort of lose sight of some of these things.
I was interested to know if we have any information, data research into what is climate change doing to the water supply.
Well, we have projections, right? Bacteria really like warm weather. So it's going to make it worse. Several scientists told me we're going to find more contaminated water. We're also going to be using more water, right? because crops will need to be irrigated if we can't count on regular rainfall. So it is a problem that should be solved yesterday.
Let's switch over and talk a little bit about food and food access now. This blew my mind. I did not know this, but the original inspiration to feed hungry children in America is connected to the US military. Joanne, do you want to explain kind of the
I'm going to let
backstory
Colleen
there? Or
do. I'm going to let
you wanna take
Colleen.
this?
She loves this one.
So
She does. It's fascinating, but it makes her happy to talk about it.
okay, after I was not happy, Joanne. After World War II, the military looked at the number of people it had to reject because they were not physically fit to serve in the military. And in many cases, it was a result of childhood malnutrition. So generals went to Congress and said, we're not going to be ready for the next war if we don't feed our children. And that is why you have school nutrition programs. That's why you have originally school lunch, and now there's breakfast and supper going on in many places. But it was not a humanitarian thing. It was a war readiness thing.
And so while some of this developed kind of in that post-war era, then we ushered in some big, big cuts with both the Reagan administration and the Clinton administration. Can you kind of start with Reagan? What happened there? What was cut and where did that money go?
Well, it went to tax breaks for rich people, and to some extent on weapons spending, but mainly, you know, the top tax rate has been just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking in our country while poverty has been expanding. We see these as related facts. He made major cuts to SNAP, to AFDC, which was aid to family with dependent children. He really started chopping away at the social safety net. He was particularly damaging when it came to housing. Government really got out of the business of creating affordable housing in this country. And there is a shortage that persists to this day that's part of the eviction crisis that's going on right now. He really made Americans question the basic idea that other Americans in economic distress deserved some kind of help.
He also, oh, sorry.
And I'm just going to say that that's not necessarily a partisan thing, right? Noam Chomsky refers to Richard Nixon as the last New Deal president. There are things that became the norm after Reagan that really most mainstream Republicans would never have accepted before him.
Well, and what I was going to add to that is the thing that Reagan did that I think hurt more than anything is introduce the idea of the welfare queen. Mm-hmm. So he really created and pushed that narrative. And the reason that is so horribly damaging is because Clinton bought it hook, line, and sinker, and basically used that myth to create temporary assistance for needy families. So, right, 1996, he implemented welfare reform. And that, we have baked into that, and most people don't know this, so many rules. Like one of the things that was built into temporary assistance for needy families at the beginning was something called the maximum family grant. And that was, and still exists in some states, many states have done away with it, but that if you apply for TANF and have 3 kids, you get a certain amount of money. If you then have another child while you're receiving TANF, that child won't be added to your benefits. So if you have 6 kids when you start, that's fine. You just can't have another. If you have 1 kid, because they believed, and this is in the legislation, that women had children just to receive benefits. It is roundly, it has been proven not to be true. But because of that welfare queen myth that Ronald Reagan put forward, Bill Clinton, who, you know, did lots of really great things, but certainly welfare reform, I consider to be one of the worst things that's happened in the last 30 years for, addressing poverty in the United States.
And Joanne, let's stay with you for a minute. When a government program is cut or a social safety net program is reduced,
Mm-hmm.
what tends to happen in America is a nonprofit or a community group or some sort of grassroots effort. That's what takes the place of that system that may have been in the past. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that trend and the way that we operate?
Sure. And it is also, again, uniquely American, this idea that nonprofits should take the place. You know, I'll talk about it a little bit from my own perspective, because that is what happened with the New Haven Diaper Bank, the National Diaper Bank Network. It's not that diapers were ever provided. It's that, when you go back to prior to Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, AFDC, was, first off, it was a little bit more money, but it was available for as long as people needed it. And it was available when, for however long, and now it is time limited. So, I think that we have sort of implemented these policies that don't work, and then we just build on them more, if you know what I mean.
I wonder if you all share a little bit about how prevalent what we call in America failure to thrive, which is basically malnutrition or improper growth. It doesn't seem like an American problem, but there are many, many young children, especially kind of the under fives, who are not growing properly and who are significantly underweight right here in America.
Yeah, we found that there were failure to thrive clinics at every major children's hospital. And just to be clear, failure to thrive is something that in other parts of the world we call malnutrition. There are children not developing well because largely of iron deficiencies. We found that so common and with such long-term consequences for the kids. And when I talked to a doctor who specialized in it, she defined failure to thrive as a real mother blaming condition. That traditionally it was like, well, you're not feeding him right, or you're not doing this, you're not doing that. Somehow mom was not nurturing and caring the way she should be, when in fact either mom was breastfeeding without being sufficiently nourished herself, or mom couldn't breastfeed and couldn't get the baby adequate nutrition because of money, period.
One thing that you all make such like a clear, beautiful point in the book to cover is this idea that, as you said, if someone is low income and low resource when it comes to food, it's really hard to decide how to spend your money for food, because one thing parents in poverty are terrified of is waste. So it's really difficult to introduce, a vast array of new produce or interesting lean proteins that are maybe unfamiliar to kids, because what happens if a 7-year-old or 3-year-old at the table pushes it away and then it's wasted? I think about that with my own kids. I have a 7-year-old who eats the rainbow, who will eat anything that I put in front of him. I have a 3-year-old who I'd say eats 5 foods with nutritional value. And that's just reality, no matter what I offer. So there is a lot of built-in waste in our household as I try to get her palate to expand. So what happens if you're on a fixed income, or you only have so much money for SNAP, or you only have so much money to spend on food? How are you supposed to introduce a balanced, nutritious diet to your kids?
You can't. And I think it goes even beyond the money. It goes to time, and it goes to resources in, one of the things that I think a lot about basic needs. It's what I think about all the time. And I used to work with families who were homeless and help them move into housing. And one of the things I was always struck by is, we have subsidies for housing, right? We have public housing, we have Section 8, not enough of it, but they exist. But we don't, when a family moves from homelessness to housing, there's no state or federal subsidy that buys the things they need, that buys, kitchen equipment. you can't save food if you don't have a container to put it in and a refrigerator. You can't chop vegetables if you don't have a sharp knife. You know, we don't, as a country, we just don't like to talk about the little things. We talk about these really big things. But, as anybody who has fed themselves or tried to feed a family knows, there's just a lot to it. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into shopping and preparing food, especially when you have a family and you're trying to attend to, as you said, the various food choices they have. And then as kids get older, you have one child who is a vegetarian, one child who's a vegan, one parent who stopped eating meat because, so all of these things are just so complicated. And I do believe it is uniquely American to actually talk about food as a privilege. The fact that we don't say, everybody needs to eat every day, 3 times a day, it's pretty widely accepted. Why is it that we're still talking about things like school lunch debt? We should not have kids whose parents are struggling to pay for their lunch at school. But it's accepted as a policy issue.
Go ahead, Colleen.
And to what Joanne said about time, I think that is so under discussed, how much work it is to be poor. We spent some time at a program for girls in middle school who had failed PE. And they had to come to this summer program and do exercises. And they also learned about the food environment, which meant they gave them cameras. The girls went around and took pictures of all the fast food places in their neighborhood and all the stuff at the gas station to buy that was junky. And they could all tell you chapter and verse of what was wrong with fast food. And after they did this really impressive presentation, I said to them, so do any of you still eat it? Oh yeah, they all still ate it. And one girl told me she ate it every day. And I said, so tell me more about that, given, everything you just educated me about. And both her parents were CNAs. They worked in nursing homes. In order to support the families, they each had to work 2 shifts a day. So one parent would pick the kids up from school, go through a drive-through to get them dinner, drop them home, and go back to work. And, this program was being well funded by a foundation. And I kept thinking, if they'd given them $100 so that one of them could take a shift off a week, the kids could have gotten a healthy dinner. Or if they'd worked for a living wage, if they'd, it really seemed like fixing poor people to me, like, oh, they just don't understand. We just have to educate them about eating healthier. No. It just wasn't possible to eat healthier in the time that life allotted them.
And one thing that we also talk about a lot is this idea of buying your way out of poverty. So that as a woman of privilege, I can complain bitterly about how stressful my life is, right? I can talk about how hard it is to do everything, to get everything done, and that's with all sorts of support. And so when I first started the New Haven Diaper Bank, my kids were young and I was doing direct service work, and I constantly thought about how hard I thought my life was, with young kids and working and all of that. And I would, drop my kids off at school, drive a mile away in the same city, and see this level of poverty that people in my neighborhood, same zip code, couldn't even imagine. And I think part of the issue is we allow for sort of people of privilege to talk about how stressful life is. And we don't think about what it means to take away the car, take away the cell phone, take away the landline, take away the partner, take away all the money to pay all your bills. And somehow they're supposed to work harder than me. And I always like to encourage people to think during their day-to-day life of every time they spend a little bit of money on something that is a convenience, that sort of buys their way out of a problem. And that could be, a charger for your phone. It could be picking up lunch for your kids at a drive-through if you forgot to bring it. It could be buying a coffee because you didn't have time to make it at home. Every time you do that, you are using your money to avoid a problem that someone else might have, who doesn't have means. And I think it's a good way to sort of start to think about that.
So in about 10 minutes, we'll get to some questions. I also want to get to a few solutions, but one last basic need that I want to just let someone respond to is just this concept of hygiene. Why is that so often overlooked as part of this conversation? People don't seem to think about things like tampons and soap and toothpaste. Why is that? It seems honestly almost the most basic among them.
So I'll take that one, right, Colleen?
I think so.
That one's mine. It's really interesting that people don't think about it. I think there are a few reasons. First and foremost, I think as a society, we don't like to talk about our bodies very much. We don't like to talk about all of the things we need to keep ourselves looking and smelling good. So that's one part of it. I also think that people who make policy, by and large, have never had to use the services that we create. So, SNAP, food stamps, were created as a subsidy for farmers, not as a nutritional. I mean, it was partly as a nutritional subsidy, but it was mostly for farmers. So of course, food stamps, SNAP benefits, don't cover anything in those 4 huge aisles in the middle of every supermarket in America, right? Hygiene products, over-the-counter medications, cleaning supplies. So there's all of that. And I think people who've never used SNAP benefits, I know people who don't use SNAP benefits, think that it's just money, that you can go to the store and buy whatever you need. And that's just not true. I think because the things are considered ancillary, they're, add-ons, they're not things that policymakers think of as keeping you from being able to do the things you do. At the National Diaper Bank Network, one of the things that we do, one of our sort of taglines is real talk about real problems. I think a lot of people just don't like to talk about these things. And, years ago, I was on a commission, a group about oral health. And I was constantly amazed that, dentists would go to low-income schools and talk about oral health. They'd give out toothbrushes, but they never gave out toothpaste. Why? Because it's too expensive. But to take that and not say, well, that's a problem, because if we know people don't have toothbrushes, we can assume they also don't have toothpaste. But the answer to that was not, we're going to find money for it. It was, well, we're getting them toothbrushes, so that's better than nothing. And it just doesn't make sense. And so, basically, the role that I think that I play in a lot of policy conversations is exactly that. Saying, yes, all these things are really important, but let's make sure we give people shampoo also, and let's make sure, one of my pet peeves is birth certificates. Every locality has their own way of doing it, but everybody loses their kids' birth certificates at some point. I'm never the only woman or only parent who has. And you have to take time, right? You have to take time off during the day. It's another one of these buying your way out of a problem, to go downtown, pay to get it. You know, our system is not set up realistically for people to take advantage of things.
Since we're on the topic of hygiene, YNL submitted a question, may as well get to it now. Can you talk a little bit about exemptions to period supplies and the impact on women and their families? Obviously, we know not having access to period supplies doesn't just mean a mess. It's really, really inconvenient and disruptive to everyday life.
You should stay with this, Joanne.
Okay. So it's really interesting. Lots of states have taken on the issue of what people are calling the pink tax, right? Taxing period products. And we at the Alliance for Period Supplies, the National Diaper Bank Network, strongly agree that basic needs should not be taxed. We don't think of it so much as a pink tax, as it being an issue of women. We think of it as sales tax is a regressive tax. And so, poor people spend a greater portion of their income on sales tax than people who have more money. But not having the period products you need, not considering period products to be like toilet paper and soap in a bathroom, right? 50% of the population needs period supplies frequently. And so, but we don't. We consider it to be a luxury. But when you don't have period supplies, like when you don't have diapers for a child, you can't leave your house. And so you can't go to school, you can't go to work. And it's embarrassing. And I think that a lot of these things with hygiene, you have the reality of not being able to do something because you don't have the hygiene product, but also the shame that's associated with that. And it's embarrassing, and you can't call your boss and say, I have my period and I don't have any product, so I can't come to work today, right? You can't say that. So you then have to lie and say something else. And it's sort of this whole snowball effect.
Colleen, I hope you'll outline a few of the solutions you guys talk about. The way the book is organized has kind of you talk about the basic needs kind of chapter by chapter, and then there's like a little bit of kind of action items to consider at the end of each chapter. And some of them are really unique. I mean, obviously most of us can think about advocating to members, elected officials, that's kind of a logical conclusion, but there's some really interesting recommendations. For example, one that caught my attention that I hadn't thought about was in the chapter about food. You all recommend that people go to the public school and eat lunch in the cafeteria. Why would that be something to do that might help engage you with how kids are receiving nutrition?
Because if you won't eat it, they probably wouldn't either. We talked with school nutrition professionals who talked about kids who they know were not eating at home, who would still not eat a meal in the cafeteria if they didn't like it. Kids have great willpower in some ways. So it's important that the food is nutritious and that it's something the kids would actually want to eat. And this is not a slam against people who work in school nutrition programs. That is really hard given the amount of money that they have to spend on a given meal and the various regulations that have to go into that meal. So it's really hard. Also, things like, is there a place to get water in the cafeteria? It's really kind of rare for CAFs to have an easy place for kids to access water. The dairy industry and the sugar industry both make sure that there is milk and chocolate milk in the cafeteria. Lots of kids of color are lactose intolerant. Can you get water, which is probably, a much healthier choice than many things they could get in the cafeteria. It's the nitty gritty of everything that really matters. That's what so much of Joanne's work is about. Well, do they have diapers and wipes? So, all right, so we've got some school funding for nutrition, but are the kids getting nourished? Are the kids eating it on a consistent basis? Is it something that's really healthy for them and that will teach them good eating habits that they can take with them for their lifetime?
Interesting little side note, during the pandemic, we've all heard a lot about how the supply chain has kind of been disrupted by shutdowns and work shortages, et cetera, early in the pandemic. And now that things are up and running, everybody is behind on getting product out. I've read that several large school districts in Texas, for example, are having a really difficult time getting flatware, like plastic forks. So they're having to kind of reinvent the wheel and figure out ways to provide finger food lunches that kids can eat. So obviously this delicate balance of trying to make it work for everyone is probably only getting trickier right now.
Oh, it's really hard. I don't in any ways mean to underestimate it. We talked with some guy who had won this internationally award-winning restaurant. He was a, very famous chef, and he was having trouble coming up with healthy school lunches that the kids in his community would eat. It's hard work.
Why is bottled water problematic in your view, Joanne?
So it's problematic because the bottlers, the companies that bottle the water, pay very, very little for the water that they bottle. So basically, they're taking what is a free resource and making you pay for it. And honestly, it's one of the things in the water chapter where Colleen and I were like, could this be right? Like, is it true that Nestle paid like $1,000 to get this water that they're selling for $2 a bottle? It's just, to me, it's sort of the picture of when you talk about problems of capitalism, this is a problem. We have made a commodity that is necessary and available out of reach to many Americans. So, bottled water. So there's that, and you just accept when you are in a community where it's necessary. There are some communities where bottled water is the answer, for reasons we spoke about. But if it's not necessary, then it's actually we believe, actually adding to the problem to buy it, because you are encouraging this sort of overtaking of a natural resource by a private company to make money. And it doesn't do anything, bottled water is no healthier. It can, unless you live in a community where the water is tainted, but it's no healthier, and it's and it's actually worse for the environment.
It's like privatizing air.
Right.
We had a question from a member of our audience about the Flint water crisis. Could either of you share your take on that? Most of us are familiar with what happened in Flint with high lead levels in the water and the potential ramifications for kids and babies, especially. I just wonder if either of you can kind of comment on that.
It's shameful that crisis is not over, right? It's shameful that we've been talking about this for years. And what we found in our research was scientists telling us that there are Flints all over this country. Most of our water infrastructure was post-World War II at a time when we thought lead pipes were just fine. Many cities aren't testing, or they're doing very unsensitive tests, because who wants to know that you need to invest $100 million in your water system that you're not going to recover? But we have to.
And one thing, actually, this is one of my favorite things about the book. We had these boxes, a Better Way boxes that give examples of places that have done things in a really positive way. And one of those examples is about Lansing, Michigan, which is just down the road from Flint. They made a proactive decision to switch out their pipes. They bonded it. They paid for it over a period of, I think, 10 years. And they did it before it was a problem. So it can be done. It is a matter of will.
I wonder if you'll share a little bit. We mentioned earlier in this conversation, you all did, that you think many elected officials probably have never had to be even tangentially involved in these social programs that they're in charge of funding and structuring. We had a question from, or it was more of a comment from someone in our audience. Juliana asked or said that our state legislature in Texas does not pay a living wage to the elected officials. So you have to be independently wealthy to even run for any of these positions. And she makes the point that as a result, they can't represent our interests. Do you have any thoughts on just the way that governments are structured and who's even able to participate?
Well, it's true where we live as well. Our legislature is quasi part-time, but really full-time. And a lot of people are in the legislature who are essentially lobbying for their boss. We did talk to a number of people who had tried to run for office without money. And some of them won and some of them didn't, but it needs to be a lot easier, more public financing, more treating legislation and being a legislator as a job would certainly help. It needs to be within the reach of ordinary people, and it's not now.
We don't even have 10 minutes left, I'm sad to say, but I have kind of two big questions I want to ask. First of all, will one of you explain kind of how schools, places of worship, community centers so often become kind of safe places, havens, even homes for families who are struggling and living with poverty? How have those organizations and community hubs stepped in to kind of play a role that maybe they weren't originally imagined to play?
I think that that's true of so many places, like you're saying, schools, hospitals, because we don't have a true social safety net. You know, there isn't a place that you can go to have all of those needs met. Our social safety net is really complicated and really difficult to manage and sort of get around. So I think that that's really the biggest issue we have, is that we're just not looking at it the right way, I think.
Do you think it places a high burden on those groups? I mean, I think about the story in the book where a mother of 6 who was very poor died of asthma at midnight. And the next morning, most of the kids showed up for school that day and everyone was kind of stunned. And the kids were like, this is where we go. This is the place we have to be.
Right. I mean, look at schools. We now have, we have food, we have breakfast, lunch, and dinner in many communities. Many communities have school-based health clinics, so people get their health care there. Many communities provide other kinds of support, emotional, mentoring, things like that. So people really don't, it is the place where they go. And it does put a huge amount of stress on the people who work in those. And I think that's true. It's true of food banks. It's true of diaper banks. When people are in need and they go someplace and they see and meet somebody who is caring and is trying to help, because the systems are so complicated, they ask. And as a caring professional, you try to answer them. And I think that is in large part what expands programs, is that the need is just so great.
I also think we sort of rely on the kindness of strangers because we don't have a robust social safety net. So if you work with people in poverty, at some point you have bought somebody a winter jacket and you've given somebody a ride and you've done all these things your boss would actually yell at you for. Because if you don't do it, there's nowhere else. There's literally nowhere else.
And sorry. I was just going to say,
Please, Joanne, go ahead.
It's I think that Colleen and I really believe that we can make these changes. And it's why we're sort of, strident. Well, we're so strident about it, because we do know that poverty is not gravity. Poverty does not have to exist. And given that, we know we can end it. But it takes real commitment to change. And it takes a lot of people who are comfortable becoming uncomfortable.
I want to talk about this kind of big idea that we set up a little bit at the start of our conversation, but why is it that you all believe that misconceptions around and about poverty actually worsen it?
Because we know what the solution to poverty is: giving people resources through a fair wage or increased benefits for people who need them. And we really, really resist doing those things because there is this societal belief that, oh, you can't give people things, you'll create dependency. There is this societal belief that people in poverty are sort of naturally malingering. And, you know, Joanne and I always say, everybody we interviewed for the book works harder than we do. You know, we talk to people working 3 and 4 jobs. It's just not true. And I think if more people appreciated that, we would be more open to solutions that really work.
We have a question from Brenda who says, just quite simply, what can we as residents do to help? How can we be of help?
So, you know, we do give a lot of examples in the book, but they range from, you know, relatively easy, like if you do a food drive, right, which many of your people listening to us probably do. After you do it, take a picture of it and send it to your elected officials, local, state, and federal, and say, I vote based on my beliefs, and my belief is that every person should have the food that they need, or something like that. You can do that with diaper drives, but interacting with your elected officials is really important. You know, each chapter we give different ideas, but one other idea, which is a little more of a heavy lift, is you know, get involved in your local planning and zoning board. In most communities, they're very, you know, nobody wants the roles, and they're available. And even if you don't want to be on the commission or the committee, you can go to meetings. And because that's where housing policy on a local level is made. So if your community doesn't allow for multi-family housing or has rules about the amount of land every house has to have, those are policies that can be changed on a local level. And so it's another area, even like I said, if you don't want to go to the trouble of getting on the commission, go to meetings, read about it, write a letter to the editor. You know, any little thing like that can make a big difference.
Do you think there's value in becoming the person who signs up to speak at the school board meetings and the city council meetings and just becomes one of those regular players and gets in front of the folks who are supposed to be held accountable?
Exactly.
And you have so much more power locally, right? You know, your vote really matters in your community more than it matters in your state or on a federal level. So, you know, not that you shouldn't be writing your members of Congress too, but, you know, the local game is important.
Very.
I've been doing a lot of reading lately for work about all different topics, everything from, you know, mental health to underemployment to, you know, kind of what happens when wildlife comes into conflict with people. And there's this interesting takeaway. It seems like every single book I've read lately talks about how important it is to have community buy-in to an issue. Real, like how when you share a problem in the community, if the community really all takes a piece of it, it starts to go away. And I think about all the examples in this book of when this happens, how things change. For example, the schools that decided to install a washer and dryer so that people could come and do their laundry there at odd hours of the day and evenings, and that kids could be assured they'd have clean clothes for school. Can you kind of explain the central role that kind of, not just community, but the shared burden of a problem like poverty in the community? How important is that? And is that kind of the first step into really solving this problem?
I think it changes everything. So there's a little nonprofit that I volunteer with in my town. And it's a basic needs bank. It gives period products and diapers and shampoo and all sorts of stuff. And whenever I'm writing a kind of fundraising appeal or anything, I always say our neighbors deserve this. Our neighbors need that. You know, as we've talked throughout our conversation, the othering of people is really what makes poverty persist in this country. And part of what we tried to do in the book was show no matter who you are, there is somebody like you. You know, there is somebody with your background, with your experience, who looks like you, who's living in conditions you just can't stand. So I think showing poverty in your own community, where it's very often hidden, right? Even wealthy communities have pockets of poverty. I think that that can help to stop the othering. And I think it's a really effective strategy.
Joanne, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, she hit the nail on the head. I agree with her completely.
Well, I think we're kind of in a nice place to probably end this conversation. But before we go, I'd love both of you to share kind of the biggest takeaway that you got out of writing this book and doing all this research.
So for me, I think it is, as I said before, that poverty is not gravity. That we have policies in our country that hurt more than they help. And I believe that the people who implemented them thought they were doing the right thing. I really do. I have to believe that people go at things with a positive attitude and with sort of people's best interest at heart. But I think that we have to really look at our belief that we can't end poverty in the United States. It is, I think, a deeply held belief, and I think it's just wrong. And to me, I think that in the book, we were really able to show the different ways that policies actually cause many of the problems that we experience. You know, and I don't mean to sound like we're bashing elected officials, because I do believe most of them go into this for the right reasons. I think it's really, really hard.
Colleen, I'd love you to share your base takeaway as well.
My biggest takeaway is wages. You know, wages have been flat since the 1970s, and inequality has been increasing since the 1970s. We don't pay workers at the bottom of the chain nearly enough, and poverty is inevitable. We always prescribe work as the solution to poverty. It's not always, it's not a jobs problem, it's a pay problem. People need to be fairly compensated. And we need to realize that if we're not fairly compensating workers, what we're doing is subsidizing corporations with tax dollars, right? Because if I pay my employees so little that they need SNAP and Section 8, then is SNAP and Section 8 really benefiting my employees, or is it benefiting me? We need to do a little twist on our thinking with that.
Well, Joanne and Colleen, I want to thank you guys both for just a fantastic conversation. Again, the book is called Broke in America: Seeing, Understanding, and Ending U.S. Poverty. Thank you guys so much for being here. And thank you to our audience for all your thoughtful observations and questions as well.
Thank you for having us. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
What an amazing and intriguing conversation, Courtney, Joanne, Colleen. Thank you so much for joining us all today and for leading us in this conversation, for sharing your wonderful insights. I think as you all demonstrated, addressing these underlying social, economic, and policy issues can really make huge changes systemically and go a long way to addressing and ending poverty in the US and around the globe as well. Thank you all for joining us so much today. I'd like to remind our audience as we begin to wrap up that there is one more webinar in the remaining series, and we hope you'll join us for that. If you haven't registered, there's time to do that through Eventbrite. and you can search for the Dallas Coalition for Hunger Solution to sign up for that. Next Friday at 10 o'clock, October 1st, we will talk about addressing food insecurity and healthy food access. We will have a host of wonderful folks talking about Dallas initiatives and best practices. We're excited about that. Mark Edwards will be our host that day, and our moderator will be Dr. Doric Earl, who is with the SMU Meadow School of the Arts, a professor of social entrepreneurship. And Dr. Earl will highlight those local practices and innovations, those who are doing incredible work in this space. Again, I want to, on behalf of our coalition, thank Joanne, Samuel Goldblum, and Colleen Shaddox, and Dallas' own exceptional interviewer, Courtney Collins, for their insights and contributions to our understanding that we can end poverty in our society through some very concrete steps. And I think if we can work on making sure that no one is in the situation like Colleen's mom was, who had to wash her bloody feet out in the sink in front of her children, then we will all be better off for it. So thank you. I also want to thank my fellow members of the planning committee for this year's Hunger Summit, Catherine Nicholson, Kristen Chan, and Mark Edwards. Appreciate the work that you all do throughout the calendar year on the summit. And I want to recognize the leadership team of Dallas Coalition for Hunger Solutions as an amazing group of talented and committed community advocates who appreciate the value of bringing organizations and community leaders together to work in partnership. Together, we can achieve so much more than we can by ourselves. So thank you all for the work that you're doing. I also want to thank Ednice Providence for managing the technology this morning, for keeping us running smoothly. Thank you, Ednice. I have to give a huge shout out to Wyanella Henderson Green, who I bet most of you know and work with. Wyanella really runs all the traps and continues to keep us all organized, keep us running smoothly, not only for the summit, but for the coalition. So Wynella, we really could not do this without you. And thanks to all of you for attending today, for your commitment to understanding these issues and the challenges that many of our neighbors face. We appreciate your concern, the work that you do with us to help provide access to healthy food. We encourage you to learn more about being involved in our coalition. We encourage you to join one or more of our action teams. Maybe you're already a member of the coalition on an action team. Join two for next year. And be looking for information and ways that you can engage with us in the coming weeks. I would just like to ask one more moment of your time as you leave the webinar today. You'll receive a brief pop-up asking for you to do an evaluation. And remember that your voice matters, not only in public policy, but here as well. Take a minute to let us know what you thought about today. Let us know about what subjects you're interested in so that we can include those in future. Again, we look forward to seeing you next week on Friday, and we hope you all have a safe and good weekend. Thank you all for joining us today. Take care.